Mank is like the only movie I was looking forward to this year, at least that I knew was coming out this year last year. So you can imagine my delight when I watched it, and it was pretty good. This is of course the story of Herman Mankiewicz writing Citizen Kane and reflecting on the relationships that inspired it, primarily his relationship with William Randolph Hearst and company, told fittingly in a style that mirrors Citizen Kane's flashback structure.
I don't want to see another goddamn homage in anybody's movie.
This is rightfully fuel for some discussion about auteurism and artistry. How can this be Fincher's vision if its visual language is so heavily indebted to the film it's about? I think there's something to be said of the fact that this flashback structure is a technique Citizen Kane monumentally helped pioneer that became sort of a common practice, and of the fact that Mank's implementation of it isn't exact mimicry. Kane gives us a bunch of perspectives of the same person, and Mank gives us one person's perspective of a bunch of people. Because of this, I think the film walks a line where Fincher's using what's now a common structural approach in its own right, but it's in service of a film specifically known for that approach, so it pays the immediate homage Orson Welles criticized, but I think works on a higher level that demonstrates the influence of the original film, just by virtue of the technique having its own legs. Not that we necessarily need to be taught that Citizen Kane was influential, but I'm just saying it operates on more levels than your standard run-of-the-mill homage. And I should mention, just because it's thematically in line with the film, when I say Fincher, I mean both David Fincher and Jack Fincher, just to give credit where credit's due. I think this line carries over to other aspects of the film as well. Aside from structural homage, we get some shots ripped straight out of Kane and other visual cues, at least reminding us of specific shots from that movie. And I think the cinematography is the most hit-or-miss aspect of the film. Fincher's of course known for embracing digital filmmaking and using that as a tool for precision, never trying to mask the digital nature of his films, but with Mank, we see a clear attempt to also lean into classical studio filmmaking. We get a similar sense of the film embracing the fact that it's a film, but with Fincher still unabashedly shooting this digitally with a lot of computer VFX, the digital feeling calls attention to itself in a way it hasn't in his previous films, and it looks a little wonky at times. Usually he leans so much into digital, it actually reaches a new level of immersion, but here I think it's often at odds with that classical style. It reminds me of the approach Alfonso Cuarón took with Roma, another VFX-heavy black and white period piece, but because that film is hard committed to a sleek, modern, anti-nostalgic look, it's seamless, which is ironically very similar to Fincher's typical approach up until this film. There's also a surprising number of shots that look almost overexposed, and some shots that have been virally lampooned for how dark they are. I'm not sure what the intention behind this contrast is. I'm usually fine with stuff being a little too dark, and honestly, I am here as well. I don't really have a problem with how this looks, but the overexposure is interesting, especially after just hearing that anecdote from Steven Soderbergh about Fincher using a laser pointer to call out like a corner of a frame that was half a stop too hot. So this was clearly a precise decision. This film was a departure from Jeff Cronenweth and was shot by Eric Messerschmidt, one of Fincher's longtime camera department guys who's only recently started DPing stuff, mostly TV, including Mindhunter. And while I have these reservations and could probably say this is the worst looking Fincher film, there are still some really incredible shots here, and I actually do like some of the incongruous digital artifacts. There's a digital haze that reminds me of Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. I don't know what that film was shot on. I don't even know anyone else who's seen that movie. I watched it on my 5th birthday and fell asleep, so I'm mostly going off the trailers here. The haze also reminds me of this artifact in old TV broadcast tapings, where it looks like anything bright enough to the point of clipping goes black instead of white for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on there chemically, if anyone in the comments wants to help me understand this phenomenon. But anyway, we're talking Mank here, let me get back on track. To say this is Fincher's worst looking film is really only such a bad thing when you forget how high of a bar he's set for himself. Now, admittedly, the film takes a little while to find its footing. It takes its time setting up the location Mank is writing at, and the flashbacks take their time just setting up the Hollywood studio setting, and there's not a lot of conflict or tension or anything to suggest where the story's going for a while. We get some stuff with Lily Collins' character Rita, but I'd say the film only really kicks off when Marion Davies shows up. With her, we start to see a relationship building with Mank that I'd argue is the central relationship of the film. She provides the gateway to Hearst and anchors Mank emotionally to that circle, giving him a reason to be cordial to people he'd otherwise publicly disdain. Amanda Seyfried was also perfect casting for Davies, and between her performance and that complex relationship, every scene she's in is a highlight for the movie. But This is an ensemble piece that Mank is navigating. Here we get a damning depiction of the influence of Hollywood film studios on real-world events, and in a particularly exciting sequence, we see the toldest takes on the character Shelley, who directs a piece of Hearst propaganda that basically ends up working. Now, this being a movie about a movie, it has to establish why movies are important. With something like this, you have the optimistic, wow, movies have the power to change lives, which of course has the backside of, wow, movies have the power to ruin lives. And I think this is important territory to navigate, not just for the sake of giving the audience a reason to care, but also for examining such a controversial tentpole figure in film history and what it says about media in general. This is also stuff that's been well discussed for years, but I think Mank frames everything in a sort of tangible packaging for this discussion. For as decorative as the dialogue is, the narrative is pretty accessible and easy to follow, and it's the broad strokes that we're able to read into. Paul Schrader posted on Facebook about the movie, criticizing it for not having a very flawed protagonist. I'm not exactly going to disagree with him on that. The closest thing Mank has to a flaw is his alcoholism, but it's the type of alcoholism that's kind of framed as like the price of his genius, and everything else about him is smart and sociable and right. I'm thinking about other popular characters that fit this archetype. There's Pierre Bezukhov, but he lacks the social graces Mank has. There's Tyrion Lannister, but he has external flaws that give him emotional vulnerability. And then there's like Jack Sparrow, Rick Sanchez, and I don't want to get into that. Point is, Mank himself doesn't have a whole lot of vulnerability, and as I was thinking about that, I remembered his Don Quixote speech. As he's talking, he's comparing Hearst to Quixote, but he goes,
"Notably rich and powerful can't win over an audience unless notably rich and powerful sees the error of his ways in the final reel. So what do? We give him ideals."
And even though Mank isn't rich and powerful, and he's sort of an underdog going against the juggernaut studio system, I'd say his lack of vulnerability or flaw beyond the surface level alcoholism virtually makes him rich and powerful in a character sense. What he's saying functionally applies here in terms of audience empathy. But, like he says, the film gives him strong ideals. And maybe the argument that that's enough for Mank to be a compelling character only works under this logic the movie itself is asserting, and thinking about other characters with strong ideals, the gold standards are also deeply flawed. But I'll say watching this movie, I didn't have the same experience Paul Schrader had with the character. The film's treatment of Orson Welles has also been a bit controversial. He spends most of the movie checking in on Mank over the phone, but he eventually shows up as a third-act complicator, which the film makes sure to cue us in on.
You're Mr. Third Act Complicator.
There's some tension from these moments of checking in, but the pressure isn't too hot until this scene toward the end, where he kind of blows up. Now, Tom Burke is a really great Orson Welles. I love the way he goes,
"Mank, it's Orson Welles."
I'll say though, when he's really throwing a fit, and I think this has more to do with how it's framed, he looks really small and pathetic. And at first that bothered me, thinking about all the dominating images I've seen of Orson Welles. But then, I started thinking about the critical approach the film is taking towards him, and I figured it was probably intended to make him small and meek. In any case, Burke gets the general essence down. This scene is a little weird though, because I guess it's the climax of the present day scenes, and it's intercut with the climax of the flashback scenes. Both are pretty effective scenes on their own, but I have mixed feelings about leaving each of them at certain escalating beats. On one hand, it delays the scene, which furthers the tension and escalation, but I feel like when it goes back to the given scene, continuing from where we left off doesn't feel like the same rising action. It kind of just feels like we've come back to something we put on pause. I don't know if this was done for pacing reasons, or if the film is trying to compare Welles to Hearst. I think that's a little more likely, especially considering that the final note the film ends on is a jab at Welles. Throughout the whole movie, Hearst is pretty much Mank's enemy, so I think this final jab only makes sense if it's channeling what we've seen about Hearst towards Welles. There's something to be said about Welles's legacy, and the notion that he wrote his own draft that he combined with Mank's, thus earning his co-writing credit, and a lot of people are offended on the behalf of Welles. I don't think this tarnishes his reputation in any way. I mean, he's already a complicated figure, and this just stirs the pot a little more. Not to mention, it's fiction. It's historical fiction. but it's fiction. And honestly, I don't think you could do what Welles did without having as big an ego as the film makes him out to have had. And I think that's the main function the Hearst comparison serves, ego being so central to the
magic of the movies.
Even Mank's ego is what got him where he is, though again, he's not exactly criticized or indicted by the film. I'd say the bigger problem with ending on this Welles note, though, is that it's not the central relationship. Again, Hearst was maybe intended as the central relationship, and if the film is trying to use Welles as the conclusion to that relationship, that makes sense. But like I said, I feel like Mank's relationship with Marion Davies is the central relationship. Even if she's arguably a proxy to Hearst, in terms of what sticks and resonates the most emotionally, it's Mank and Davies, and they get their catharsis relatively early on. And after that, I wasn't really concerned with how things would end between Mank and anyone else. At least not as much. So just as the film slowly starts up before kicking off with Davies, once we get the Davies resolution, it kind of slows to a stop. And honestly, I think there's kind of a beautiful symmetry to this. While I can point out what makes these bookends not super exciting, with this symmetry, it feels a lot less like a flaw or a shortcoming, and more like an intentional structural choice to ease us in and out of the story, which I think fits the subdued nature of the rest of the film. If it had only started out slow and ended on a bang, or vice versa, that would be a different story. But it's sort of like in music, how repetition makes an accident sound intentional and musical. Not that there are any accidents here, screenwriting is a lot less spontaneous than musical performance, but I think that idea still carries over. It's also worth considering that this is David Fincher's late father's decades-old script, so he probably didn't want to tamper with it too much and wanted to just let it be his father's work. Another act I think is thematically in line with the film. But I don't even think the script needs a lot of tampering, as most of the things I've complained about do have some sort of justification. I feel like I've said a lot of negative or backhandedly positive things about this movie I liked from one of the best working Hollywood filmmakers. So I should say that, despite being critical about most of the things I've discussed, this is a great movie. It's often gorgeous, and the dialogue has a kinetic and musical quality that blends with the subdued and hypnotic direction in a really complex and interesting way. It's the kind of movie where you can put on any scene out of context and enjoy it for how it looks and sounds and plays out, but it is all in service of a narrative not just about Hollywood or movies, but about media and the political and personal ways it can be weaponized, in conversation with one of the industry's most important entries that reminds us how timeless it is, without seeming like a mere companion piece. This is still very much its own film with its own things to say. The sets are elaborate and elegant, and the score is a lavish orchestral arrangement that itself is in conversation with Bernard Herrmann's work on Kane, reverently devoid of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's typical modern flourishes. If you're looking for a number, I'll give it an 8. Maybe not a bold, italicized, underlined 8, but an 8 nonetheless. That's my time for today. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.